Joe DiMaggio entered Marilyn Monroe's life at a moment when the world had already decided who she was. To Hollywood, she was an image. To the public, she was desire. To the studio system, she was a product that needed to smile, comply, and never slow down. Joe did not meet Norma Jean. He met Marilyn Monroe at the peak of her visibility, when escape from that image was already becoming impossible. He was America's most disciplined sports hero, built on routine, control, and loyalty. She was the most visible woman on earth, living inside constant exposure, expectation, and pressure. From the beginning, the imbalance was not just emotional but structural. One came from a world where privacy still existed, the other had none. Their relationship formed quickly, not because of passion alone, but because both were searching for something they believed the other represented. Joe saw in Marilyn a softness he thought needed protection, a woman overwhelmed by attention and danger. Marilyn saw in Joe a solid presence, someone grounded, predictable, and strong enough to stand between her and the chaos that followed her everywhere. But what began as a desire to protect slowly turned into a desire to control. Joe's understanding of safety was built on containment. Marilyn's survival depended on expansion. Those two ideas could not coexist for long. The marriage lasted less than a year, but its collapse began almost immediately. Marilyn's career did not pause for marriage, her image did not soften, her visibility only grew. Every appearance placed her body, her smile, and her existence into the public domain. Joe watched as the world consumed her openly, applauding what he considered invasive and humiliating. He believed love meant shielding her from that exposure. She believed survival meant embracing it on her own terms. Each public moment widened the gap between them. The breaking point did not come from a single incident, but from the realization that Joe could not stop the machine surrounding her. He could not silence the cameras. He could not remove the crowds. He could not undo the image that had already eclipsed the person. His frustration hardened into anger, and anger into behavior that neither of them could live with. The marriage ended not because love disappeared, but because it had nowhere healthy to exist. Marilyn walked away carrying guilt. Joe walked away carrying failure. What followed is often ignored because it does not fit the dramatic arc people expect. After the divorce, Joe DiMaggio did not disappear from Marilyn's life. He did not attempt to reclaim her publicly. He did not profit from her name. He did not speak. Something fundamental shifted after the marriage ended. The desire to possess was replaced by a quieter instinct, vigilance. Joe stopped trying to shape Marilyn's life and started watching it from the edges. He no longer believed he could change who she was, but he believed he could intervene when the world became too dangerous. As Marilyn's mental health deteriorated under pressure, medication, exhaustion, and constant scrutiny, most people around her responded by stepping back. Studios labeled her unreliable. Insurers labeled her a liability. Friends labeled her difficult. Doctors labeled her unstable. Joe did none of these things. He did not try to analyze her. He did not try to fix her. He simply remained close enough to act when she could not. This was not romance. It was responsibility born from regret. By the early 1960s, Marilyn's life had become a continuous state of surveillance. Doctors monitored her body. Studios monitored her productivity. Government agencies monitored her associations. The press monitored her decline. Every part of her life was documented, discussed, and judged. Privacy became a luxury she no longer possessed. In this environment, protection did not mean affection. It meant extraction. It meant removing her from situations that threatened to erase her entirely. Joe DiMaggio became one of the few people who could still move decisively around her without needing permission from the industry that surrounded her. His name carried weight. His reputation commanded respect. When Marilyn was placed into a psychiatric facility that treated containment as care, the situation escalated beyond discomfort into danger. She was isolated, restrained, and stripped of autonomy under the justification of treatment. What others accepted as procedure, Joe recognized as captivity. At that moment, the story between them changed permanently. Joe did not act as a husband. He did not act as an ex-husband. He acted as a guardian responding to a crisis he believed he had failed to prevent years earlier. He moved quickly, using influence rather than emotion, authority rather than persuasion. Marilyn was removed from that environment not because the system decided she was safe, but because someone decided she deserved safety. This event did not restore her stability. It did not end her suffering, but it altered one crucial dynamic. For the first time in years, someone intervened without expecting performance, gratitude, or access in return. Joe did not publicize what he had done. He did not frame it as heroism. He simply returned to silence once the immediate danger had passed. From that point forward, Joe DiMaggio remained a presence without ownership. He did not manage Marilyn's career. He did not re-enter her romantic life. He positioned himself as a barrier rather than a participant. When she faltered, he responded. When she disappeared, he searched. When others hesitated, he acted. This pattern would continue quietly, unnoticed by the public, even as Marilyn's life moved closer to its final collapse. The world would later argue endlessly about who loved Marilyn Monroe, but love was never the question. Protection was, and for a brief, fragile stretch of time, when the system closed in and escape became impossible, Joe DiMaggio became the one person willing to step between her and a world that no longer saw her as human. After the intervention that removed Marilyn from institutional confinement, Joe DiMaggio did not become more visible. He became more deliberate. His presence in her life shifted into something almost invisible but constant. He no longer attempted to guide her choices or interfere with her independence. He understood by then that Marilyn did not need direction. She needed insulation. The world around her had grown sharper, faster, and more predatory, and every failure, delay, or emotional collapse increased the pressure closing in on her. Joe positioned himself outside the spotlight, close enough to step in, far enough to avoid becoming another force pulling at her. Marilyn's final years were marked by contradiction. Publicly, she remained an icon. Privately, her body and mind were breaking under the weight of expectation, medication, insomnia, and loneliness. Studios still wanted her image, but not her vulnerability. Politicians wanted her discretion, but not her instability. Doctors wanted compliance, but not questions. Friends wanted access, but not responsibility. In this environment, Marilyn's sense of safety was constantly disrupted. Stability never lasted long enough to take root. Joe DiMaggio did not attempt to repair the damage he saw accumulating. He understood too late that no single person could undo what years of exploitation had carved into her. Instead, he focused on reducing harm. When Marilyn retreated from public view, Joe respected the silence. When she resurfaced, he remained alert to signs of danger rather than success. He did not measure her well-being by box office numbers or press coverage. He measured it by whether she was eating, sleeping, and being left alone. As Marilyn's dependence on medication deepened, those around her normalized it. Pills became routine, prescriptions multiplied, and the line between treatment and dependency blurred. The industry viewed this as a manageable inconvenience. Joe saw it as erosion. He could not regulate her doctors or control her prescriptions, but he could observe patterns others ignored. He noticed when her voice weakened, when her movements slowed, when the rhythm of her life lost coherence. His concern was not dramatic, it was practical. He understood that collapse rarely announces itself, it arrives quietly. Unlike others in her circle, Joe did not demand emotional access. He did not interrogate her pain or attempt to extract confessions. He believed that constant explanation exhausted her more than silence. His version of protection was restraint. He did not push for closeness when she withdrew. He did not disappear when she became difficult. He remained available without being invasive, present without being consuming. This balance was rare in Marilyn's life and fragile. As political and media attention around Marilyn intensified, so did the risks surrounding her associations. She was no longer just a celebrity. She had become a liability. Rumors, surveillance, and strategic distancing surrounded her. People who once sought her proximity now calculated their exposure. Invitations disappeared. Promises dissolved. Joe watched this shift with clarity. He recognized the pattern from another world, one where public figures were celebrated until they became inconvenient. He understood what happened when institutions protected themselves before protecting individuals. In moments when Marilyn felt overwhelmed, Joe became a point of orientation. Not a solution, not a savior, but a constant reference. Someone whose reaction was predictable. Someone who did not escalate crises or amplify fear. His steadiness contrasted sharply with the instability that defined the rest of her environment. Even when he could not prevent her from spiraling, his presence reduced the speed of her descent. As her final year approached, Marilyn's life narrowed. Professional setbacks compounded emotional exhaustion. Trust dissolved, support systems fractured. Each disappointment reinforced her deepest fear that she was valuable only when functional. Joe did not argue with this fear. He did not try to convince her she was wrong. He countered it by action. When others withdrew, he remained. When silence settled, he did not fill it with demands. He understood that Marilyn's sense of worth had been eroded by a lifetime of conditional approval. Joe's protection did not resemble romance. There were no declarations, no public reconciliation, no attempt to rewrite history. What existed instead was consistency. He monitored situations without announcing himself. He intervened without spectacle. He absorbed frustration without retaliation. This approach did not save Marilyn from the forces consuming her, but it softened their impact. It gave her brief intervals of calm within a life defined by exposure. As Marilyn's world grew more dangerous, Joe became increasingly wary of those who claimed authority over her well-being. Doctors, advisors, executives, and acquaintances all spoke confidently about what was best for her. Few accepted responsibility when those decisions caused harm. Joe trusted observation over credentials. He believed patterns mattered more than explanations. When something felt wrong, he paid attention, even if he could not always act. In the weeks leading toward her death, Marilyn's isolation deepened. Communication became fragmented. Schedules dissolved. People spoke around her rather than to her. Joe sensed that she was drifting beyond reach, not because she wanted to disappear, but because exhaustion had overtaken resistance. He remained alert, but even vigilance has limits when information is withheld and time collapses. What Joe DiMaggio represented in these final months was not prevention but presence. He could not dismantle the systems surrounding Marilyn. He could not neutralize the secrets, pressures, or dependencies closing in on her. What he could do was refuse to abandon her narrative to others. He observed carefully, remembering details that would later matter. He paid attention when others dismissed inconsistencies. He remained grounded while the world prepared to move on. Protection does not always succeed in saving a life. Sometimes it succeeds only in preserving dignity. Joe DiMaggio could not rescue Marilyn Monroe from the final convergence of forces that overwhelmed her, but he positioned himself as a witness rather than a consumer of her collapse. When the moment came, he would act not out of shock, but out of a long-held understanding that the world would not handle her ending with care unless someone intervened. When Marilyn Monroe died, the world reacted with speed but without precision. Headlines formed before facts stabilized. Conclusions arrived before questions. Public grief emerged alongside public certainty, and within hours her life was reduced to a single narrative that allowed institutions to move forward without disruption. The machinery that had followed her for decades shifted seamlessly from consumption to closure. For Joe DiMaggio, the moment did not register as spectacle. It registered as failure, not the failure of love but the failure of protection that arrives too late to matter. Joe did not rush to cameras. He did not issue statements. He did not challenge the narrative publicly, even as inconsistencies surfaced and explanations shifted. He understood instinctively that the world was not interested in uncertainty. It wanted resolution. What he focused on instead was containment, not of information but of memory. He recognized that the final violation of Marilyn's life would not be her death, but the way it would be handled afterward. Joe assumed control of her funeral arrangements with a decisiveness that surprised many. Hollywood, which had built her image and profited from her exposure, was excluded. Executives, producers, and industry figures who had once surrounded her were denied access. The ceremony was reduced to a private gathering, stripped of performance and spectacle. This decision was not driven by anger alone. It was driven by the belief that Marilyn deserved one moment in her life that was not consumed by the public. Only a small number of people were permitted to attend. The exclusion was intentional. Joe believed that those who had benefited from her vulnerability did not deserve proximity to her in death. This was not an act of revenge. It was an act of boundary setting that had come too late in her life, but not too late for her legacy. For the first time, Marilyn Monroe was not required to be available. Joe stood quietly through the service, not as a grieving ex-husband, but as a custodian of dignity. He did not speak. He did not perform sorrow. He did not allow her image to be repurposed into public mourning. The moment was controlled, contained, and brief. When it ended, the world was released back into its noise, but Marilyn was not. After the funeral, Joe withdrew completely. He did not participate in retrospectives. He did not contribute to biographies. He did not correct falsehoods publicly, even when they spread freely. He understood that any engagement would reopen her narrative to exploitation. Silence became his final form of protection. Where others dissected her life, he guarded what remained private. In the years that followed, Joe DiMaggio performed an act of devotion that went unnoticed by most. Every week, without exception, fresh roses were delivered to Marilyn's grave. This ritual continued for decades. It was not announced, it was not photographed, it was not explained. The consistency mattered more than recognition. In a life defined by instability, the repetition itself became meaning. Joe never remarried. He did not replace Marilyn's presence with another. This was not martyrdom, it was resolution. He had understood too late that his role in her life was never meant to be ownership or rescue. It was presence without demand, protection without possession, loyalty without visibility. He carried this understanding quietly until the end of his own life. When Joe DiMaggio died, his final thoughts reportedly returned to Marilyn. Not to the image, not to the icon, but to the woman whose vulnerability he had underestimated and whose strength he had misunderstood. History would debate their relationship endlessly, reducing it to moments of conflict and control. But history often fails to measure what cannot be documented: consistency, restraint, and accountability after loss. Marilyn Monroe's life remains one of the most examined in modern culture. Her death remains unresolved in the public imagination. Her image continues to circulate, detached from the person it once represented. But within that endless reproduction, one story remains largely intact because it was never offered for consumption. The story of Joe DiMaggio's protection exists not in interviews or memoirs, but in actions that required no audience. Protection is not always dramatic. It does not always arrive in time. Sometimes it exists only in what is refused: refused access, refused exploitation, refused participation in harm. Joe DiMaggio could not save Marilyn Monroe's life, but in the moments when it mattered most, he refused to let the world claim ownership over her death. That refusal is the quiet legacy he left behind, not as a hero, not as a lover, but as the only person who understood that Marilyn Monroe needed protection not from herself, but from everyone else.